The circus has always sold a particular kind of dream: sequined costumes, roaring crowds, performers who seem to defy gravity and death itself, night after night, in cities across the country. For most people in the audience, the danger is part of the appeal, a comfortable thrill, something to gasp at and then forget on the drive home. But sometimes the danger stops being a performance. Sometimes the tent catches fire, or the wire snaps, or an animal that has been pushed past its limit finally pushes back, and the people in those seats discover that the line between spectacle and catastrophe is thinner than they ever imagined. Here are 5 horrifying circus deaths that shocked the world. It was the afternoon of July 6, 1944, Hartford, Connecticut, a Thursday. The crowd filing into the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Big Top was made up mostly of women and children, the kind of audience that gathered on weekday matinees while fathers and husbands were away at war. Estimates put the number at around 7,000 people inside a canvas tent that stretched 450 feet long and 200 feet wide. The tent had been waterproofed the old way. About 100 pounds of paraffin wax dissolved in 6,000 gallons of gasoline painted onto the canvas. It kept the rain out. It also turned the entire structure into something closer to a wick. The flying Wallendas were on the wire when the fire started. A small flame appeared on the southwest side wall of the tent, low and almost easy to miss. Band leader Merle Evans spotted it first and immediately switched the band to The Stars and Stripes Forever, the traditional circus distress signal. Ringmaster Fred Bradna tried to calm the crowd and direct an orderly exit, but the fire had already shorted the power. His voice didn't carry. Nobody could hear him. What followed was 8 minutes of chaos. The paraffin-soaked canvas burned fast and hot, and as it burned, it melted. Flaming wax rained down onto the people below. The tent had 9 exits, but several were blocked by the steel animal chutes used to move the big cats in and out of the ring. Thousands of people converged on the remaining openings at once. Some were trampled. Some were burned where they stood. Others climbed the bleachers and jumped, hoping to escape under the tent walls, and many of them didn't make it. The tent collapsed in under 10 minutes. When it came down, it trapped hundreds of people beneath burning canvas. Bodies were found in piles 3 deep at the most congested exits. Some people at the bottom of those piles were found alive, shielded from the fire by the weight of those above them. The official death toll settled at 167 named victims, with a disputed additional count bringing the figure to 168. More than 700 others were treated for injuries. 2/3 of the dead were children. Among the victims was a young blonde girl found in a white dress, oddly preserved despite the destruction around her. She was assigned the number 1565 at the makeshift morgue and was never conclusively identified. Investigators Thomas Barber and Edward Lowe spent the rest of their lives trying to give her a name. They decorated her grave every Christmas, every Memorial Day, every 4th of July. When they died, a local flower company continued the tradition. The girl's true identity remains unresolved. The cause of the fire was never definitively established. A roustabout named Robert Dale Sagee confessed to arson in 1950 and then recanted. He was never tried for the crime. The circus accepted full financial liability and eventually paid close to $5 million to survivors and families. 6 circus officials were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. All were later pardoned. Survivor Carol Tillman Parrish, who was 6 years old that afternoon, said 70 years later that she could still smell burning flesh. The fire consumed the tent in minutes, but it left a mark that never fully faded. 2/3 of the dead were children who had come that Thursday to watch the trapeze and the tigers and the clowns. They had come for the dream the circus sold, and the circus could not protect them. What the Hartford fire forced into law afterward was a recognition that the practices the American circus had used for decades, the paraffin waterproofing, the blocked exits, the casual approach to crowd egress, were no longer acceptable in any structure expected to hold thousands of people. State fire marshals across the country revised their inspection standards within months. The use of flammable waterproofing on canvas was effectively ended. Permits for tented events began to require certified fire-resistant materials and unobstructed exit pathways at minimum widths set by code. None of those changes could undo what happened in 8 minutes on a Thursday afternoon. They simply ensured that the specific combination of materials and design that had killed 167 people in Hartford could not be set up again in the same way. The Ringling organization itself moved away from full tent shows in the years that followed. By the late 1950s, the company performed largely in permanent arenas. The Big Top, as a structure and as a tradition, did not survive what had happened to it in Connecticut. That was Hartford, July 6, 1944. January 30th, 1962, Detroit, Michigan. The Shrine Circus was running its winter engagement at the State Fair Coliseum, and 7,000 people had packed in to watch the Flying Wallendas perform their signature act, a 7-person pyramid on a high wire, 35 feet above the arena floor, with no net below them. The Wallendas had been building toward this kind of act for decades. Karl Wallenda had started his troupe in Europe in the early 1920s. When John Ringling saw them perform in Cuba, he brought them to Madison Square Garden in 1928. They went on without a net that first night, the net having been lost in transit, and the crowd gave them a standing ovation anyway. The family took that as a signal. More people, more height, more complexity. Each season, the act grew. The 7-person pyramid was the result of all that ambition. 4 men on the wire, 2 men balanced on poles above them, and at the very top, a woman seated in a chair. 17 feet of stacked human beings moving across a cable strung over a full arena. It was the kind of act that made people hold their breath without deciding to. The man at the front of the wire that night was Dieter Schepp. He was 23 years old, Karl's nephew, and this was his first public performance with the troupe. He had recently escaped from East Germany and joined the family act. Before the show, he had told other members he wasn't feeling well. He said nothing to Karl. Partway across the wire, Schepp called out that he couldn't hold on. He threw his balancing pole upward, trying to adjust his grip, and lost his footing. The collapse moved forward through the pyramid from the front. Richard Faunen, 29, Karl's son-in-law, fell with him. Mario Wallenda, Karl's adopted son, 22 years old, fell too. Karl and 2 others grabbed the wire as they went down. Jana Schepp, Dieter's 17-year-old sister, had been sitting in the chair at the very top. When the men below her fell, she went with them. Karl and the others caught her and held her suspended above the arena floor until ring attendants could get a net positioned underneath. They dropped her to it. She bounced off the net and struck her head on the concrete floor. Richard Faunen died of a skull fracture. Dieter Schepp died in the early hours of the following morning at Highland Park General Hospital. Mario Wallenda survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Ernie Birch, a clown who performed under the name Blinko, was waiting in the wings when it happened. He said the bodies came down like coconuts falling from a tree. Spectator O.C. Hansen described a breathless gasp from the crowd, then the sound of bodies hitting the sawdust. Jenny Faunen, Richard's wife, was standing on the platform at the end of the wire. She watched her husband fall. She collapsed when told he was gone and was admitted to the hospital that night. Karl Wallenda suffered a leg injury. When he was able to speak to police, he said Schepp had complained of illness to the other members but had never told him directly. After the funerals, Karl announced the troupe would keep performing. They repeated the Pyramid Act in 1963. Karl himself went on performing for another 16 years, doing solo walks and smaller formations. On March 22, 1978, at 73 years old, he fell from a wire strung between 2 towers of a hotel in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He was gone before he hit the ground below. The Wallendas had always said that life was on the wire, and everything else was just waiting. Detroit, January 30th, 1962, was the night that sentence stopped sounding like poetry. It was the evening of February 13th, 1931, at the Valencia Music Hall in Copenhagen, Denmark. The audience had filled the seats for what was billed as a featured aerial performance by Lillian Leitzel, the most famous female circus star in the world. She was 39 years old, a German-born American performer who had spent 2 decades headlining the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus and was, by any reasonable measure, the highest-paid woman in the circus industry. Her act was unlike anything else in the program. She would climb to her apparatus at the top of the venue, then perform a sequence of one-arm planches, swinging her entire body up and over a single hand grip hundreds of times in succession. Audiences counted the rotations aloud. She had once recorded 239 in a single performance. What made her performance possible was a small piece of metal called a swivel, a brass and steel mechanism that connected her grip rope to the rigging above. The swivel let her body rotate around her shoulder without twisting the line. It was the single point of equipment between her and the floor. That night, the swivel failed. She was mid-performance when the metal crystallized and gave way. The connection between her grip and the rigging separated, and Leitzel fell roughly 30 feet to the stage below. She was conscious when stagehands and her husband, Alfredo Cadona, reached her. She was speaking. The injuries appeared, in those first moments, to be survivable. She was carried out of the venue and transported to a hospital in Copenhagen. Cadona was himself one of the most celebrated trapeze artists of the era, and he and Leitzel had been performing together for years before they married in 1928. He stayed with her at the hospital through the night. By the next morning, her condition had begun to decline. She died on February 15, 1931, 2 days after the fall, from injuries she had initially seemed strong enough to survive. What the post-fall investigation found was that the swivel, the single component the entire act depended on, had developed metal fatigue invisible to anyone inspecting it from the outside. The piece had been in continuous use for years, repeatedly stressed by the same motion the act required. There was no maintenance protocol in place to catch the kind of crystallization that had killed her. The rigging had simply been trusted, performance after performance, until the moment it could not be. The Ringling organization did not require independent equipment inspection for its featured aerial acts. Performers traveled with their own apparatus and were responsible for its condition. Leitzel had checked her own rigging the way she always did. The flaw was deep inside a metal joint and could not have been seen with the unaided eye. What the failure revealed was a system that had relied on the experience of its performers to catch problems that, in some cases, no performer could ever have caught. Cadona never recovered emotionally from her death. He continued to perform for several years afterward, but his work changed. The lightness that had defined his trapeze act in the 1920s was gone. In 1933, he suffered a serious shoulder injury that ended his performing career. In 1937, after his second marriage was dissolving, he shot his estranged wife and then himself in an attorney's office in Long Beach, California. The chain of grief that began with Leitzel's swivel reached him 6 years later. What had drawn audiences to Leitzel was the apparent impossibility of what she did. A woman alone at the top of a venue, supported by a single rope, performing a movement most people could not have completed once, repeating it hundreds of times in succession. The act demanded that every component of her rigging hold. The night in Copenhagen, one component did not, and the fact that it was a small piece of brass and steel mechanism the size of a fist meant the entire performance ended with her body on the stage. August 20th, 1994. The Neil S. Bladel Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Circus International was midway through a performance when a 20-year-old African bush elephant named Tyke killed her trainer, injured her groomer, and ran into the streets of downtown Honolulu. Tyke had been performing with circuses since she was captured in Mozambique as a calf. By 1994, her history with violence was already documented. In April 1993, she had escaped through the front doors of a venue in Altoona, Pennsylvania, during a live performance, causing more than $14,000 in damage and attacking a tiger trainer while the circus was still in town. In July 1993, she rampaged for 23 minutes at the North Dakota State Fair, injuring a handler and scattering onlookers. USDA documents from that same period described a separate incident in which a handler beat Tyke in public until she was screaming and bending down on 3 legs to avoid being struck. When that handler walked past her afterward, she screamed and veered away. The fear response was on record. The paperwork existed. None of it pulled her from the performance schedule. On August 20th, 1994, in Honolulu, Tyke attacked her groomer, Dallas Beckwith, throwing him repeatedly across the arena floor. Her trainer, Alan Campbell, moved toward Beckwith to help him. Tyke knocked Campbell to the ground, dragged him, and crushed him under her body. His autopsy would later show severe internal injuries, including major skull and chest fractures. Beckwith survived somehow with a broken nose. Tyke then charged out of the arena and into the parking lot. A local publicist named Steve Hirano moved to stop her from reaching the street. He managed to get the gates shut, but as he tried to secure the chain, Tyke shoved them back open. She knocked Hirano to the ground and injured his ankle. A police officer nearby fired several shots in her direction, distracting her long enough that she turned away from Hirano before she could crush him. It was the kind of outcome that depended entirely on timing, and Hirano was fortunate the timing held. For the next 30 minutes, Tyke moved through the Kakeako district of downtown Honolulu. Spectators at the arena had recorded parts of the attack on home video. A professional crew nearby captured the chase through the streets and the shooting that ended it. Police fired 86 shots into the 8,000-pound animal. She collapsed from blood loss and died in the street. Children who had been in the audience filed lawsuits for psychological trauma. The details of those settlements were sealed from public record. The footage spread through television broadcasts and home video networks throughout the rest of the 1990s. Replayed so often, it became one of the defining images of that decade. People who watched it described the same reaction. The animal wasn't simply out of control, it was done. It had absorbed years of confinement, beatings, and forced performance until there was nothing left to absorb, and then it moved. Alan Campbell, the man it killed, had likely understood that risk in some form. The audiences who watched from the bleachers had not agreed to it. The children in those seats had not agreed to anything. But Tyke's case forced into the public conversation and into legislation in some jurisdictions was the question of whether elephants could be kept and worked under circus conditions at all. Animal welfare organizations had been making that argument for years. The footage from Honolulu gave it a shape the general public could no longer ignore. Hawaii itself banned the use of elephants in traveling shows within months of the incident. Other states followed slowly, and over the next 2 decades, the practice was phased out of major American circuses. Ringling Brothers retired its elephant performers in 2016. The economic model that had depended on animals doing in arenas what the species had never been adapted to do simply could not survive the images that had come out of Kakeako that August afternoon. The government files documenting Tyke's prior incidents had been accumulating for more than a year before August 20th, 1994. They did not stop the show. They did not pull the elephant from the road. They sat in federal records while Tyke traveled to the next city and the city after that, and the circus kept selling tickets right up until the afternoon it couldn't anymore. June 29, 2013, the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, Nevada. Cirque du Soleil's production of Ka was midway through its 9:30 p.m. show when French acrobat Sarah Gouillard-Guillot fell close to 90 feet into an open pit below the stage. Ka was not a standard circus production. The Los Angeles Times had described it as possibly the most lavish production in the history of Western theater. The stage had no permanent floor. It was built around a series of moving platforms that appeared to float, rotating 360 degrees, with 86 cast members performing across surfaces that tilted, rose, and disappeared. Gouillard-Guillot, known inside the company by her performance name Sassoon, had been part of the original cast since the show opened at the MGM Grand in 2006. She had performed that same show on that same stage hundreds of times. She was born in Paris in 1981. By the night of June 29, 2013, she had spent 22 years as an acrobat and aerialist. She ran a circus school for children in Las Vegas. Her son and daughter were 5 and 8 years old. The accident happened during the final battle scene. In that sequence, the stage tilts to a vertical position and performers move across it in harnesses attached to cables, with a catwalk positioned above them. Gouillard-Guillot was being hoisted upward along the side of the stage when she struck the catwalk above her. The impact sent a force up the cable, That force jarred the wire rope free from its pulley, and the edge of the pulley cut through it. She fell approximately 90 feet into a pit below the stage, out of the audience's line of sight. Eyewitness Dan Mosqueda was in the audience with his wife and young son. He watched her ascend and then simply drop. The harness remained on her body throughout the fall. Nothing had come unclipped. The wire itself had given out. Mosqueda described the moments that followed. A sound of screaming, then groaning, then a female performer crying from somewhere on the stage above. The other performers hung in their harnesses, unable to reach her or descend on their own until they were lowered one by one. Many in the crowd initially assumed the fall was part of the choreography. The realization that it wasn't moved through the theater in stages. A recorded announcement asked the audience to leave. Refunds would be offered. Gaillard-Guillot died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. She was pronounced dead at 11:43 p.m. at University Medical Center. The Clark County Coroner's Office confirmed the cause as blunt force trauma from a fall of close to 90 feet. Nevada OSHA opened a formal investigation and initially issued 6 citations against Cirque du Soleil, Nevada, totaling $25,000, and 3 citations against the MGM Grand. By November 2013, all but one of the Cirque du Soleil violations had been withdrawn. Cirque du Soleil founder Guy Laliberté said he was heartbroken. The company called Gaillard-Guillot an exceptional artist. Kay resumed performances 2 weeks after her death in modified form. The first show back was dedicated to her. She was 31 years old. Her death was the first on-stage fatality in the company's 30-year history. The circus has always asked its performers to accept risk as the cost of the work. What these 5 cases show is how rarely the people carrying that risk had any real power to refuse it. The tent burned. The wire gave out. The animals endured until they couldn't, and the trainers went into cages that had no meaningful safety behind them. The audiences went home, until the day some of them didn't.